with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center. I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's webinar. Participation will be via the chat box, so if you've got questions, please enter them in the chat box and we'll monitor that as the webinar progresses and try to get those questions answered. I'm pleased to introduce Adam Reimer, our resource today. He's a postdoctoral research fellow with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center, and he received his PhD in Natural Resource Social Science from Purdue in August of 2012. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. Hello and welcome to all of our participants today. Scott, if you could go ahead and activate the first poll. We just like to get a little sense of who's on today. So if you could fill that out while I begin. Scott, if you could move that down just a little lower. All right, so my goal today with this presentation is to talk a little bit about some of the proposed changes to conservation programs in the proposed farm bills. As many of you might know, the farm bill has not been passed yet, so these are just sort of the most current proposals that are out there. Some of my personal research background is in participation, farmer participation in programs and in conservation efforts. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the potential impacts of these changes to programs on farmer participation. One of the things I'm not going to talk about in this presentation is program effectiveness, or how effective programs are at accomplishing their environmental goals. There's a whole wealth of research out there on that topic, but that's not sort of the focus of today's talk. So I'll give a little bit of an outline about where we're going today. I'm going to start off with just kind of a brief primer on some of the environmental policy problems we have, and kind of the current state of the programs and tools that we use to address those. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the current research on farmer participation in programs, sort of what motivates or gets in the way of farmers engaging in these programs. I'll talk a little bit about the proposed changes to conservation programs, and then probably try to connect those two things. So we'll start out with our little background. So despite all of the production benefits that agriculture provides, there are a number of environmental policy problems that kind of persist both in the United States and other places. So we're talking about things like runoff of sediment or nutrients to water bodies. Water use, agriculture in the United States represents a really significant amount of water usage. So water use efficiency is something that's a concern. Degradation and loss of wildlife habitat, soil loss, air pollution. The goal of environmental policy in the United States has been to try to find synergies between environmental protection and agricultural production. They're not necessarily seen as opposites. Programs can enhance both of these at the same time. What that's resulted in the United States is a number of different, so there are a number of policy tools that are available to policymakers, and these tend to get lumped into two categories. You have incentives, or carrots, and regulation, or sticks. Under incentives, we're talking about things like education, both raising awareness of problems and raising awareness of solutions. Subsidies, which would include things like cost sharing. You could pay for performance, which is a kind of another kind of subsidy or an incentive payment. You can also have collective incentives. So instead of focusing on individual actions, you sort of target the group level. Under regulation, we might have taxes or technological standards, kind of requirements of technical solutions. Performance standards, where we require some threshold be met. You can also have a cap and trade, or some kind of a market mechanism. To address environmental problems from agriculture in the United States, we've typically relied on a couple of kinds of incentives: education and subsidies. Over time, that's resulted in a portfolio of a broad range of conservation programs. As we saw just a minute ago, the number of policy problems are diverse and wide-ranging. So to address those, we need a whole suite of different approaches to be able to to try to improve things. Scott, if you could go ahead and activate the second poll now while I introduce the programs. Just want to get a sense of how familiar people are with the different programs. If I sort of introduce each one. Programs tend to get categorized under two broad categories. We have land retirement or easement programs. These would be things like conservation reserve program, which I'm seeing is people are quite familiar with. That doesn't surprise me at all. There are a number of other smaller programs like the wetland reserve program, which again looks like our audience today is fairly familiar with these. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about them. The idea behind these programs is to remove land from agricultural production and place it in some sort of conservation cover or conservation usage. We also have working lands programs. The idea behind these are to address things like water quality problems, water use efficiency on active agricultural land. So the major programs under this category would be the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, which again it looks like people are fairly familiar with, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. We'll talk a little bit more about those and what they do later. The other thing I should say about these programs is that there's a conservation technical assistance aspect that kind of undergirds all of these programs. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is a USDA agency that focuses on providing technical assistance to farmers. In addition to those sort of voluntary incentive-based programs, there's also a conservation compliance system. What this means is we have some requirements that are tied to primary payments, including commodity payments and conservation. So in order for farmers to receive these kinds of payments, they have to meet these conservation requirements. The primary one is that farmers need to have a conservation system in place to address soil erosion on highly erodible fields, and there's a classification system for that. There are also the sod buster and swamp buster rules. Those are really designed to protect sensitive grasslands, highly erodible lands, and wetlands that were not in production prior to 1985. The programs have changed pretty significantly over time. We'll kind of go through some of the changes over the time period. So starting in the mid-1980s, the CRP was created, and we had a really pretty significant growth in funding, as you can see, primarily in the land retirement category. And for much of the 1980s and 1990s, that was the primary approach, at least money-wise. In 1996, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program was created. It was sort of a small, kind of a pilot program until 2002, at which point the CSP was created, and those two programs got much larger throughout the last decade. So the most of the growth in conservation spending has been in that working lands category. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about what determines farmer participation in programs. So as I was saying, the conservation programs are voluntary. They are incentive-based, but at some point farmers have to sign up for the programs. They have to volunteer for the programs in order for the programs to be effective, for them to meet some of their environmental goals. So we see in the social science literature a number of different kind of broad categories of factors that influence farmer participation. There's the program payment level. Again, as incentive-based programs, the payments are important. But in addition, we have farm factors that are important, farmer factors, so the person makes a difference, and community factors. I'll go through each one of these and give some examples. So under program payments, farmers are willing to accept a cost share system, so that it's not necessary that the government provides 100% payment, but farmers do tend to need some sort of compensation, and those payments need to cover at least some of the expected direct costs of adoption. Typically, when we're talking about different conservation measures, they cost some money to just implement. Whether it's a physical structure or changing equipment or changing management practices, there is a cost associated with that. There's also could be an expected loss of revenue. That's particularly important with land retirement programs where land is being removed from production. There's also this idea of uncertainty. So anytime a farmer changes a management practice or a management system, there's a potential risk there. And so farmers need to be sort of compensated for that. In the end, though, we see farms are economic enterprises, at least most of them are. And so the financials are important, but farmers themselves are not motivated solely by economic incentives. There are other things that matter as well. So the first category would be farm factors. These are things like farm size. Farms are not monolithic. There are a whole range of sizes from tiny hobby or retirement farms to large-scale crop and livestock production systems. Farm tenure is important. Farm ownership is complex in a lot of ways, and whether a farmer is renting land or they own the land or there's some sort of joint ownership, all of those can have impacts on the farmer's capacity to engage in conservation. Production systems also vary pretty significantly, and they can have pretty significant implications for conservation adoption. So we're talking about things like livestock versus crops, commodity crops versus specialty crops, the corn growers in the Midwest versus the tomato growers in California or Florida. Those are very different farm systems, and they face different costs and different incentives. Conventional versus organic makes a difference. Commercial farms versus hobby farms also. I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Farmer factors are also important. As I said, the person makes a difference, and people do vary. Things like age are important, particularly when you're talking about kind of planning horizons. So an older farmer, somebody who might be close to retirement, has a shorter time frame in which they're making decisions than, say, a younger farmer. Education makes a difference, or it can make a difference. Values, beliefs, and attitudes, so sort of the internals of a person and what they value, how they evaluate different kinds of information, that makes a big difference. So attitudes for the environment have been shown to be very important. One of the things that conservation professionals talk about a lot is this idea of a conservation ethic, and that can vary. Attitudes toward the government are also important. There are a number of cases where farmers might be very pro-conservation but are reluctant to engage in a government program. And their values and beliefs about farming in the first place make a big difference. And this is sort of a tie to this farm factor. So small farms, and this is just an example, but a small farmer who might be maintaining their farm for lifestyle purposes has a very different view of farming than, say, a larger farmer who is primarily engaged in sort of an economic activity. So those sorts of differences can make a difference in how farmers perceive conservation programs. Beyond the individual, community factors are also important. This might be called the information environment. So the kinds of information that are out there, the kinds of kind of social norms are important. Outreach history. What kinds of conservation practices have been promoted in the past, how effectively those relationships between conservation professionals and farmers have been managed, that can make a difference. And community social norms are also important. Farmers tend to farm in places that they've lived maybe their entire lives. They know other farmers, they communicate, and whether there's sort of a community effort to engage in conservation on a large scale, that can influence farmers pretty significantly. So when we look at how program structure interacts with participation, we see some interesting things. So when it comes to land retirement programs, and here I'm mainly talking about CRP, these programs are older, they're much more established, and what that leads to is really high familiarity. Studies in Iowa and Indiana have shown near universal knowledge of CRP. Farmers even tend to have a very intimate knowledge of how the program works, much more so than with other programs. There's also some evidence that land retirement programs are better for certain kinds of farms, for smaller farms, maybe for farms that are transitioning out, so we have the retiring farmers. This makes sense if we think about the idea of a farmer who may be less focused on production and maximizing land in production, might be willing to pull some land out, maybe make their management easier, not have to manage as many acres, as opposed to the larger farms that are maybe more focused on maximizing production. With working lands programs, what we're talking about here are modifications to production systems. So again, they're sort of inherently better suited for farms that are more focused on production. A lot of conservation practices have production benefits as well. So there's sort of another incentive beyond just the program and the program payments to adopt practices. There's also a focus on livestock in the EQIP program. Currently, 60% of the total funds are spent on livestock practices. So that makes a difference. Working lands programs also require more management time and effort than other programs, both programmatically, so just engaging in the program in the first place, signing up, keeping up with the contract, requires more management time. This leads to lower awareness of the program, higher transaction costs. So it just costs the farmer more time and energy to go in, sign up for an EQIP contract, manage that contract, than it might for a CRP contract. Working lands programs are also resource concern driven. And what that means is that the allocation decision, so who gets funded, depends on how effectively they're meeting a resource need. So again, one of the major focuses of the EQIP program, for instance, is water quality. Water quality problems may be more of a significant concern on larger farms, more production-oriented farms, in which case EQIP is just a program that's a better fit, if you will. So as I was saying, farms are not really a monolith, so these are just some figures that show kind of what we're looking at when we talk about farm variation. Just one of the things to pay attention here. So when you look at the percentage of farms, most farms in the United States are in these small farm categories, retirement farms or residential farms. When we look at value of production, however, most of the production is concentrated in these larger farms. And then in the percentage of farmland owned, it's relatively even across the categories. So farmland is distributed roughly equally between these groups. So if we look then at program participation and where program payments are going, when we look at land retirement programs nationally, most of the money is going to these smaller farms. In working lands programs, however, most of that money is concentrated in the large family farms, very large family farms. Again, going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, that's not surprising given that programs like EQIP are really kind of driven at addressing the kinds of concerns that may be more common on large farms. Okay, so I'm now going to shift a little bit and talk about some of the proposed changes to the conservation programs in the new Farm Bill. I guess I shouldn't call it the 2012 Farm Bill, as it's not certain that we're going to get a Farm Bill this year. So just a little bit of background. The Senate passed their Farm Bill, so that passed the entire Senate in June. A couple weeks later, the House Committee on Agriculture passed their Farm Bill. However, that never came up for a floor debate or a vote, so it's sort of stalled at that point. Given the short sort of time frame, it's not certain whether we're going to get a Farm Bill this year. I'm not really going to talk a lot about the politics of Farm Bill. I'm far from an expert on those, but just kind of listening to what folks are saying, it doesn't seem likely that there's going to be a new Farm Bill this year. However, when you compare the House and the Senate conservation titles, they're more or less similar. I mean, there are some differences, especially when it comes to spending levels, but there seems to be a lot of agreement between the two bills as to what the new direction should be. So I think what we can do is we can then talk about, whenever we do get a Farm Bill, what it's likely to look like. So I want to go through kind of program by program and talk about some of the similarities and differences between the two bills. So both bills have a reduction in CRP acreage. This is a pretty significant drawdown. So the current enrollment is, or cap is 32 million acres, and that's going to be reduced down to 25 million. There's some very small differences between the two bills on how quickly that step down occurs, but the end result is the same, a smaller CRP. Both bills also have some changes to grazing and haying allowances. Currently, there's very little allowance for any production at all or livestock usage of CRP land, and there are going to be some changes that maybe expand that a little bit. What that should do is make CRP more accessible for livestock operators. So again, it's one of those kind of farm differences that in the past has been sort of a barrier, and this might make it a little bit easier. One of the other interesting things I think about this is that this is more of a what you could call a working lands approach to CRP, where CRP has traditionally been focused on just simply removing land from production and having it be solely conservation oriented. The idea here is to try to find these synergies where you can allow some agricultural production, in this case, say grazing cattle or whatever, on CRP land, yet still having ecological value to that acreage. So there are other land retirement programs, as I mentioned. Both bills create a new program, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. What this does is it consolidates these other land retirement programs, the Wetland Reserve Program, Grassland Reserve Program, and Farmland Protection Program, Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, I should say. It rolls those into one kind of larger program. It has a lot of the same goals. It still focuses on protecting wetlands and sensitive grasslands, protecting farmland from development into some other land use. As with these other programs, this easement program continues to focus on government and nonprofit partnerships. Regional conservation programs, currently there are a number of these programs that are specifically focused on certain geographic ranges or kinds of problems. So both new bills create a new program called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So it consolidates 4 existing programs into a new program. The idea behind this is that money will be targeted at kind of large-scale geographic areas based on need and how effectively those areas can kind of come together to address a given resource concern. This program, it relies on partnerships. Really, one of the focuses here is on regional partnerships between the federal government, state government, local government agencies, nonprofits. The idea is that there's money in this program, but it also then these groups can leverage other funds. So there's funds set aside in these other programs like EQIP that's specifically available for these regional efforts. So shifting to the working lands programs. So EQIP is largely staying the same. The Wildlife Habitat Incentives Program, which is a small working lands program that's focused on wildlife habitat, is being consolidated with EQIP. So there will be a set number or a set percentage of the dollars of EQIP that will be specifically targeted at wildlife habitat practices. So it sort of keeps the purpose of that program but simplifies the system a little bit. There's also a small difference between the two bills when it comes to payment levels. There used to be a payment cap of $450,000. So a farmer could receive, on one contract, could receive up to $450,000. In 2002, that was reduced to $300,000. The House bill returns the cap to $450,000. I'll talk about the significance of that here in a few minutes. The Conservation Stewardship Program more or less stays the same. However, there is a drop down in acreage in this program as well. There is a difference between the two bills and how much. So the Senate cuts by about 2.5 million acres. The House cuts by an additional almost 1.5 million acres. So CSP becomes quite a bit smaller under the House bill than the Senate bill. There are some other non-funding differences as well in programs. One of the ones I think is particularly interesting comes to program applications. The Senate has language that would implement one initial application. Currently, when a farmer goes in to apply for a program, they have to submit a contract for that specific program. So say a farmer wants to take advantage of EQIP, they'd go in and they'd fill out an EQIP application. They might work with the NRCS to kind of find the best fit, if you will. So this would sort of simplify the application and process where a farmer would simply apply, so they'd indicate kind of what their resource concerns are, and then they can work more actively with the conservation professionals to find the right program for them. The House doesn't have this language, so it would leave the current application process in place.
Adam, there's a question about the prior slide.
Okay.
John's
let me go back real quick.
Okay.
Okay, so the House bill is an increase in the payment cap. So the House bill would allow larger contracts. I hope that clarifies. Yeah, sorry about the double from there. Okay, there's also a significant difference in the two bills in conservation compliance. One of the big shifts in the Farm Bill that's not related to conservation is from commodity payments to crop insurance. So the Senate would tie the current conservation compliance measures to crop insurance in addition to the conservation payments and commodity payments. In other words, farmers who receive crop insurance benefits through the federal government would need to meet conservation compliance measures. There are also a number of minor programs, and these are things I hadn't brought up earlier. These are much smaller, more targeted programs. More or less, they're the same between the two bills, except the Senate creates a new small program that's targeted at what are called terminal lakes. Without going into too much detail, basically these are kind of small lakes or wetlands, mainly out west, that don't qualify currently for other programs. So the Senate would create a new program that has a small amount of money that would be specifically for those cases. All right, as I said, the big differences here between the two bills are in funding. So there are a number of numbers here. You'll see that they're largely the same, right? CRP drop down is about the same. These small programs and the regional program are more or less similar. The totals are similar. The big difference I want you to pay attention to here is the trade-off between CSP and EQIP. So the House bill has a much steeper cut to CSP, but largely maintains current funding for EQIP, whereas the Senate approach is much more balanced between the two. So again, the takeaway here is that CSP would get much smaller under the House bill than it would under the Senate bill. Okay, so I want to go back now and talk about some of these changes in the context of what we know about why farmers do or don't participate in programs. So we'll go through sort of these four broad categories. So in terms of program payments, so we have this House change to payment limits. What that might mean is if you have a higher maximum payment but a fixed amount of money that can go to contracts, you might see larger contracts that result in fewer contracts. This isn't a guaranteed thing by any means, but it's possible. It kind of depends on how money is allocated. This could also result in a skewing towards larger livestock operations. When you look at money that's currently spent on EQIP, most of the bigger contracts are going to livestock operators who are implementing waste management facilities or something like that that are quite expensive. So it's not really a program payment per se, but again, one of the significant themes in both farm bills is a significant cut to all programs, particularly some of the bigger programs like CSP, EQIP, CRP. When we talk about farm factors, we see and this would again go back to this trade-off between land retirement programs, which is maybe the older method, and the working lands programs. So the cuts to CRP, the land retirement program, are more significant than to the working lands program. So we see this increasing shift from retirement to working lands. So if we think back to that chart that shows program spending over time, we're just going to see that get larger. The amount of working lands programs get larger compared to to land retirement programs, with the caveat that all programs are being decreased to some extent. As I said earlier, this is going to perhaps lead to a continued difference between farm participation, where you see larger, more production-oriented farms more actively engaged in conservation programs. If more of the dollars are being sort of targeted at these production-based environmental problems, it's natural to think that you would see more of the conservation dollars going to those larger farms. Farmer factors also make a difference, and this would be that trade-off between EQIP and CSP. I didn't go into it earlier because I see it looks like most people, the majority of people, are familiar with these two programs, but I'll kind of talk a little bit about the differences. EQIP is really focused on single practice adoption, so it provides contracts to farmers who want to engage in at least one specific conservation practice. It might be something like cover crops or conservation tillage or no-till. Whereas CSP is focused on whole farm planning. So the idea is that a farmer is kind of addressing one resource concern. It might be water quality or wildlife habitat on their entire farm operation. So they would get a contract in which they would get money and cost share assistance to kind of go to a bigger extent, I guess you would say. So this would be this trade-off between individual practice versus whole farm. This may favor certain types of farmers. Particularly CSP is relatively new. There's not a lot of research out there, but it seems likely that different kinds of farmers are going to be interested in these different programs. So these conservation-oriented farmers with a high conservation ethic, you might say, might be more interested in engaging in that whole farm planning, an approach like CSP, as opposed to just the one-off practices like EQIP. So if the House bill were the favored route and you have a smaller CSP, this might offer fewer opportunities for those more conservation-oriented farmers to participate. They could certainly continue to participate in EQIP, but it might not allow them to sort of achieve their total goal, if you will. There are also some significant community and information factors that are being affected by changes. The main one here is the streamlined portfolio. So as we saw, a number of programs are being eliminated and rolled into combined programs or just wrapped into an existing program in the case of EQIP and WIP. Currently, there are something like 17 conservation programs, which is quite a cumbersome system. And so the idea is if you reduce the number of programs, it makes the whole system easier to understand for farmers. The other information factor here would be the application process. As I said, the Senate bill that simplifies the application process may help in lowering kind of that transaction barrier, that initial barrier when a farmer walks in the door and wants to maybe sign up for a program. This might make it easier for them to do that. There's also an increase in regionalism and local partnerships. So a lot of these programs, particularly the new program, the regional program, is really focused on the idea of engaging conservation partners at the local and regional level to kind of coordinate efforts. This has been a big push in the conservation community, I think, over the last decade or two, is to really focus on these intermediate scales, not focusing necessarily locally and not focusing nationally, but that in between to address large scale problems. One of the programs that has been eliminated or would be eliminated is a Chesapeake Bay Protection Program. The idea there is that it requires more than just one state around the Chesapeake Bay area to address the water quality problems in Chesapeake Bay. So this new approach of regionalism is really being expanded in this approach. I see there's another question. No, I did not list those programs. I don't actually know them all off the top of my head, but I could find those relatively easily, I think. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up here with a couple of kind of broad conclusions. So I think in the grand scheme of, the title of the webinar is, if Congress passes it, will farmers sign up? And I think yes. I mean, there are a number of changes that will occur that actually make it easier for farmers to participate. but the cuts in funding are going to limit opportunities for farmers to engage in programs. They might be interested in signing up, but there are just simply fewer dollars available for them to do that. The mix of participants will continue to shift as we see this shift from working lands programs, or to working lands programs from land retirement. As CRP continues to get smaller, you're going to see more of those larger scale farmers, production-oriented farmers, engaging in conservation compared to the smaller farmers. Again, this is really driven by resource problems. There are large-scale water quality issues, things that may stem more from those larger farms, and in which case this shift may be appropriate, but I think it should be known that you will see a shift. And regionalism may continue to lead to more divergent participation across the country, as some areas that are more maybe focused on solving their problems regionally, access the new regional program, access more of the conservation dollars. You may see much higher participation in those areas compared to other places. That's what I have prepared today. So with that, I think that gives us a good 20-25 minutes for questions and discussion.
Well, thanks a lot, Adam. And I guess I'll throw out a first one here. I think the current Farm Bill is perhaps designed based on kind of the average situation over the last few years. So one question would be, if commodity prices continue to be very high, or if we continue to see the availability of what I'll call minimally competing uses, such as leasing for natural gas or oil extraction with the new technologies that are coming into play now, or wind farms, things like that don't really compete with too much with crop production. How might that play into the kinds of programs you're talking about? Will that create incentives for farmers to get larger still, to add land, to be able to kind of take advantage of some of those opportunities, plus the programs that you've talked about?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Scott. And I think to some extent, both things are driving each other, if you will. So I think one of the reasons we see a continued shift towards working lands approaches is, part of it is certainly resource driven. Part of it is because of what's going on in the farm sector. As you said, we have high commodity prices that have led to kind of increased consolidation of farms, larger farm sizes, farmers who are willing to kind of engage in multiple activities and have multiple benefits from their land going on at the same time. And I think farmers tend to see those working lands programs as a really good way to get environmental benefit while still promoting production. So I think there are a lot of, I know the EQIP, for instance, the EQIP program really has a very broad focus, including things like energy efficiency, energy development, although I'm not sure that's 100% correct, but at least energy efficiency, water use efficiency, things like those that are really kind of help that growth in larger farms. The caveat there would be that these programs are still very small. When you look at nationally, a very small percentage of farmers in a given year are enrolled in programs like CRP or EQIP. So there are a few opportunities, but those opportunities may be kind of beneficial for some of those ongoing trends that we see in the ag sector.
Okay, thanks. Andrew Seidel had a question too about is there a cap on the legal unit?
Right. No, that's a good question. So the way caps work is it's per contract. So one given farmer can enroll multiple times in the EQIP program under different contracts. They can only apply once for a given practice. So say a farmer, we'll use the case of a waste management facility. So these might be some of these really high cost projects. They can put in an application for that practice. They can get funding once, but they can never apply again for that same practice. They could apply for another practice, say pasture fencing, uh, and the cap would be sort of separate for those two. So it's not necessarily a lifetime cap. It's just a per contract cap.
Okay, and doesn't if there are other questions, now would be the time to input them into the chat box over on the lower left-hand corner. Walt has a question about the impact on the Northeast, if there's an increased emphasis on regional concerns. You know, there are a lot of small farms there, and would they adopt, I think is what he's trying to ask there.
Okay. So one of the things I didn't get into that is important to note is that there's a difference between when you talk about, and I was largely talking about sort of large-scale national trends, and there are certainly differing resource concerns in differing farm sectors, sort of state to state or region to region. So I'm assuming NE means Northeast. So stop me if I'm going off on a tangent here, but the Northeast certainly has smaller farms. They kind of a different farm sector compared, I mean, especially compared to say the Midwest or California or Texas, which are really regions unto their own. The Northeast still has sort of pots of money. So money is allocated to each state sort of separately. So there are still opportunities for maybe smaller farms to engage in programs like EQIP or CSP in those states. And the new regional program is really supposed to be kind of size neutral, or farm size neutral at least. One of the things I've heard from NRCS is that they're really hoping that these new approaches are, like I said, farm size neutral, and so smaller farms aren't necessarily going to be kept out of those programs. It's really about what the resource concern is and how effectively those farmers can achieve those resource goals. So I hope I answered.
Well, if not, I'm sure Walt can input another variation on his question. Peter Tarby wanted to know, you said something about the Chesapeake Bay program, so maybe just a little more explanation about that.
Okay. So I had mentioned, and I think it's called the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Protection Program or something like that. That is one of the programs that would be eliminated under the new regional conservation program. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the Chesapeake Bay area will not receive funding. It just has to go through sort of this larger program mechanism to get that. I don't know enough about that program or the region. I would suspect, given the sort of the high level of national interest and concern over the Chesapeake Bay area, that would be one of the sort of high priority areas to fund under the new approach.
Okay, thanks. And then John Zirkle wanted to know if there's a solid research basis to suggest that more conservation is achieved through targeting fewer farms versus smaller farms. There's clearly, you've shown that the program uptake is there, but what about the impact on the environment?
So again, I'm not as my area of expertise is really not in how effective the conservation programs are, but I'll speak a little bit to the idea of targeting. And I didn't bring this up kind of on purpose, but now that there's a question about it, I can talk about it. One of the things we see nationally, as program funding has gotten a lot larger, the money for conservation technical assistance has stayed roughly the same. And that's what pays for essentially the NRCS staff to go and provide technical assistance to promote and raise awareness of environmental problems and to give farmers the tools they need to address them. As that has stayed small compared to the size of programs, they're limited in what they can do as far as targeting individual farmers. So So there's not a lot of active I mean, there is active promotion of programs, but it's done through sort of mass marketing type approaches. So things like newsletters or news releases. There's not a lot of sort of specifically going out and talking to individual farmers, trying to get them to sign up to the program. It does happen from here to there, but in general, there's not a lot of emphasis on kind of getting a diversity of people in the program. It's really kind of first come, first served. So I don't think that quite addresses your question, John, but that's sort of the best answer I can give you, I guess, as far as participation goes. I can't really speak to how effective that approach is. I do know that given what a lot of the research emphasis has been on, hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico and these really large scale water quality problems, that focus tends to kind of lean towards the bigger farms. So the idea there is that you really are more effectively achieving conservation goals by going after the bigger farms.
Andrew Seidel had another question here about whether I don't think it was discussed here today, but in the bill, is there anything about first or second generation biofuels?
There is not. The energy is covered under a different title, so there's not a lot about biofuels specifically in the conservation title.
Okay, great. Well, I think it looks like there might be one more question coming in here from Brian Kerwin, so we'll just hang on just a moment to see what comes in that way. Something came in from Mace Vaughn. Any thoughts on the future of the CTA and possibly growing this pool?
Unfortunately, I don't think there are good prospects for that. I didn't go into it specifically, but there are some small cuts. I mean, it's not a huge cut, but there are some cuts to CTA as far as I can tell in both bills. So that in a relative sense, that pool of money is not going to get bigger anytime soon. I will add to that one of the reasons behind the idea of sort of going with a regional approach or devolving conservation efforts to a more local or regional level, the idea there is to take advantage of some of the local groups that have sprung up, local conservation, whether it's like a conservation district that's a government agency, local government agency, or nonprofits. There's some really large nonprofits, sportsmen's groups like Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited have really engaged actively on the ground in some of these places. And one of the ideas is that the federal government can provide some of that money and some of that coordination and take advantage of the local capacity, if you will, to provide some of that technical assistance and especially some of the promotion activities. One of the concerns I would have with that is that when you look at local capacity, it varies pretty significantly from place to place. So going with that devolved approach, some places are going to really excel. Some places that have a lot of energy and enthusiasm and technical knowledge are going to do really well. And some areas that are lagging behind may just lag further behind.
Okay, thanks a lot. And then there's another question from Brian. If conservation compliance is no longer a requirement, what changes do you anticipate in participation across sectors?
So conservation compliance is interesting because it's not that conservation compliance is going to go away. It may or may not be tied to crop insurance. Again, if the major shift is to crop insurance away from some of these other programs, then fewer farmers will sort of may not feel, I'll rephrase that. Some farmers may feel it's no longer necessary to engage in conservation compliance if their only payment from the government is coming through crop insurance. I'm not sure how large a group that is necessarily. So I don't necessarily think that a lot of farmers are going to all of a sudden go out and start, tearing up wetlands or sensitive, high erosion land in order to kind of do away with the conservation compliance, if you will. I know politically, and again, I don't want to get too much into the politics, but I know there was a big fight in the Senate over conservation compliance, but it did end up passing by a decent margin. So my guess would be there's probably a decent chance that, well, that certainly that's going to be an issue when it comes time for the House debate. Uh, I would say there's a decent chance that would probably be included for crop insurance under the new Farm Bill, but it's hard to say.
Aaron Thompson is asking here about, there's been a withdrawal from enrollments in the CRP because of the higher prices in the commodity markets and other things going on. Would you see any movement towards more perpetual arrangements and trying to achieve some of these goals?
Right, that's a good question. There's not in CRP, but one of the things the new easement program does is it maintains. So currently under the Wetland Reserve Program, Grassland Reserve Program, there are multiple kinds of arrangements that you can qualify for, and the payment levels vary depending on what it is. So you could have a 30-year easement or a permanent easement. I know it seems to me when I read the bills that there's maybe a little more emphasis on those permanent easements through the new program. I think CRP is probably not going to go that way, although I do know that some kind of advocacy groups have promoted that idea of longer term contracts. Currently the CRP's 10-year contracts, and there's been some discussion at least of the idea of creating longer term easements or protection arrangements, if you will.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I think I'm going to turn off the recording now, but